Hey, I'm Nico, and I am in Professor Phelps' 1301 class, and today I will be showing you how to create a loop. So, the problem behind this program is that a music class is having a rap battle today. The class will be split into two teams, and they will be competing over 5 rounds. You want to create a program using loops that's going to keep score, then you want to show the score of both teams, and at the end you want to announce the winners. So in the problem, it already goes and announces the name of the teams. So team 1 is Dope Records and team 2 is Fresh Beats. Now just to save time, what I did was I went ahead and wrote up the program, but I will be explaining each component. So to start, the program says that you're going to be creating a program for two teams. Obviously, you won't know what their scores are until the rounds happen. So because of that, what I did was I imported java.util.scanner. The scanner class is going to let the user input whichever team it is that won. So when we go here into our body, I went ahead and created a scanner object. I named my object KB, stands for keyboard, just so that I won't be typing in the long-term keyboard later. Now we're going to have to initialize and declare a variable that's going to hold the total points for the teams. Each win is going to be 1 point for the teams. So I went ahead and initialized and declared one for Dope Records and Fresh Beats. So since it's going to be based on a point system and the points are going to be whole numbers, I went ahead and created them as ints. Now of course neither team is going to start off with any points, so I initialized it to 0. Now the next portion of this is going to be to actually create the for loop. What I have here on these slashes is the setup for the for loop. So let me get rid of these so that you can see the way they actually look. Now since this loop is specifically a for loop, you're going to use the word for. Now what that's going to do is it's going to tell your program, okay, this is that type of loop. Now there's 3 components inside of these open and close parentheses. There's the initialization, the test, and the update. The initialization is for a counter, so that counter is going to keep track of how many loops have already happened. So let's go ahead and create that initialization. Now always your loop is going to happen 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, as many times as you want the loop to happen. Therefore, there's never going to be a decimal point there. So we're going to initialize this variable to an int. You can name it whatever you want. You can name it count, you can name it dog, you can name it birds. I'm going to name it I just for simplicity's sake. Now the test. This portion of the for loop is going to test whether or not the loop has hit its maximum amount of runs. So, well, actually, I'm sorry, before we get to that, let's go back to the initialization. I've only declared it, but I have to initialize it. Now I'm going to initialize it to 0. Now back to the test. This test is going to make sure that the loop isn't running more than it should, or the loop isn't running in a scenario where it doesn't need to run. So we've used this variable I over here in the initialization. So that's going to be the variable that we use in our test. Now we know that there are 5 rounds going on in this rap battle. So we're going to need this loop to go 5 times. When we're deciding how to write this test version, you need to look at where your initialization is. I've initialized it to 0, so that means that my test is going to have to be I less than 5. Initializing it to 0 means that 0 is actually going to count as the first loop. So 0 is 1, 1 is the second loop, 2 is the third loop, 3 is the fourth loop, and 4 is the 5th loop. If we set it less than or equal to 5, it would actually end up looping 6 times, which is not what we want for this program. Now, of course, I could always change my initialization to 1, and then I could set it I to less than or equal to 5, and then it would also loop 5 times. Either one is acceptable in a for loop. Now, this update portion is what's going to update the loop and tell it which number of repetitions it's on. Our variable that we're using within this for loop is I, so we're going to continue that trend. Your variables in all 3 of those components of the for loop have to be the same. So now I, and we want it to update, so we want it to increment since we're going from 1 to 5. And the way you increment something is simply putting plus plus at the end. Now our right here within the curly braces is a statement. Now with for loops, if you only have one line of coding below that for loop, you actually don't need these curly braces. What the curly braces do is it tells the program that everything within those curly braces is meant for the loop. If you only have one line of coding, then you don't need those curly braces because after it reads that first line, it immediately stops the reading for the for loop, and everything after that is considered its own item. For this specific program, we're going to have multiple lines of coding here, so we do need the curly braces. Now, we need to make sure that the user has a place to enter which team won. And we're going to want our program to ask that question for as many times as we have loops. So we're going to go ahead and write our system.out.print, which is going to prompt the user to enter the response. So what that is going to do is it's going to ask the user to enter in 1 for dope records, 2 for fresh beats. So of course we're going to need to use our scanner object here to keep track of the answer. So I need to initialize my answer to whatever it is that the user input. Now when I declared this, I used an int, and that is because I want them to answer either a 1 or a 2. So just to keep it all clear for myself, I'm going to make that an int. Now all we need is a else if statement. So if the answer equals 1, then team dope records plus plus. So that'll increment the amount of points that team dope records has each time that it is told that they win. And then we do the same for team fresh beats. However, we're going to do else if, because I want to make sure that if the user enters a digit that is neither a 1 nor a 2, it doesn't count as an automatic win for team fresh beats. So we'll do else if answer equals 2. Team fresh beats gets incremented. And that concludes our statement within our for loop. And you'll see that here we have the open curly braces and the closing curly braces. Now I'll go ahead and go down and show you the rest of the program. So outside of our for loop, we'll have system.out.println dope records plus team dope records. So this will actually insert the value of how many points they've gotten. And then within quotation marks, fresh beats, and outside of quotation marks, plus team fresh beats. And that'll insert the value for team fresh beats. And then we have one more if statement right here. This one is an if else statement. And this one is Team Dope Records. If Team Dope Records is greater than Team Fresh Beats, of course this is talking about the values for each, system.out.println Team Dope Records wins. Else, system.out.println Team Fresh Beats wins. So now let's go ahead and compile this. Operation complete, and let's run it. So let's say Dope Records wins the first round, and Fresh Beats wins the second round. Dope Records wins the third, the fourth, and the fifth. So ultimately it's going to say Dope Records won 4 rounds, Fresh Beats won 1 round, and therefore Team Dope Records wins. And that is how you use a for loop in a real world problem.